Smoke hung in the twilight like a shroud. The trees whispered in the chill wind, their branches clawing at the fading sky as if warning of what was to come. Then came the gunfire, sharp, cracking, echoing across the empty wilderness. Horses screamed, men shouted, and amid the chaos, Ethan Hale staggered through the dirt, rifle slipping from his hands as the world spun around him. The shot that tore through his side had come from behind, sudden and cruel. He fell, coughing blood, the taste of iron burning his throat. The bandits laughed as they closed in, shadows against the dimming light, their voices low and cruel. They took his meager supplies, kicked him as he writhed, and when they were done, they left him face down in the dust, like a broken thing not worth finishing. The last thing Ethan heard was the sound of their horses riding off, the echo fading into the trees. Then there was silence, a heavy silence that pressed against his chest as much as the bleeding wound. He tried to move. His fingers clawed at the soil, pulling himself forward inch by inch. He thought of his brother, buried somewhere back east, a casualty of the war they had both fought in. Ethan had survived that war, but not whole. His chest still ached from shrapnel. His nights were still filled with screams of dying men. And now, here in the wild frontier, far from the battlefields, he wondered if this was how his story ended. Not on the line of duty, not in a blaze of glory, but as carrion for the vultures circling above. Thunder rolled in the distance. The air smelled of rain. Blood soaked through his shirt, sticky and warm, yet his body shook with cold. His vision blurred, but he saw movement in the brush, a pair of golden eyes watching. A wolf. It stood still, patient, its hunger steady as it waited for him to weaken further. Ethan groaned, dragging himself toward a fallen tree. His heart pounded as he tried to load his pistol, but his hands shook too badly, the weapon slipping from his grasp. He cursed under his breath, pressing his palm to the wound to hold in what little life remained. Every breath was a battle, every heartbeat a reminder of how fragile he had become. The storm broke. Sheets of rain fell, pounding the earth, drowning the sense of blood, but also washing over his body, cooling the fever rising in his chest. He shivered, pressing his forehead to the mud. And then, just before the darkness claimed him, he thought he saw a figure, a tall shadow on horseback, barely visible through the curtain of rain. The rider dismounted with quiet grace. A man dressed in buckskin, his long hair tied back, a bow slung across his back. His face was unreadable, sharp as stone, his eyes steady and dark. He knelt beside Ethan, pressing fingers to his throat. Ethan wanted to speak, to ask for help, but only a rasp escaped. His mind screamed, "Don't trust him. Don't trust anyone." He had grown up on tales of bloodshed between settlers and tribes, of ambushes and revenge. Yet in that instant, with the storm howling and death breathing on his neck, he found he had no choice but to let fate decide. The stranger studied him a moment longer. Then, without a word, he tore a strip of cloth and pressed it hard against the wound. Ethan cried out, his vision flashing white with pain. Strong hands hauled him upright, slinging his weight over his shoulder like he weighed nothing. The world lurched, spun, and then vanished into blackness. When Ethan's eyes opened again, it was to the faint crackle of firelight. The storm had passed. He lay beneath a rough shelter of branches, his side bandaged with care. His head throbbed, his throat dry as ash. For a moment, he thought he'd dreamed it all. The ambush, the wolf, the stranger. But then he heard footsteps and turned his head. The man was there, crouched by the fire, silent, watching. The flames cast shadows across his face, making him look older than he was, though his posture spoke of strength, not weariness. He placed a strip of meat on a flat rock near the coals, the smell sharp and wild. Ethan's lips parted, but no words came. His chest ached, his body weak. He didn't know if this man meant to save him, or if he was simply keeping him alive for reasons of his own. The stranger didn't speak. He only glanced once at Ethan, eyes unreadable, before turning back to the fire. Ethan's head sank back onto the blanket of pine needles beneath him. The storm outside had passed, but inside, the battle raged on. He had survived the war, survived betrayal, survived being left for dead. Now, stranded in the wilderness, his fate rested in the hands of a man whose silence carried more weight than any words. And for the first time since the gunshot tore him down, Ethan let his eyes close. Not in surrender, but in fragile, desperate hope. The fire had burned low when Ethan stirred again. His body ached as if dragged behind a horse for miles, but the fever had broken. He lifted his head, wincing, and found the stranger crouched near the shelter's opening, sharpening a long knife with slow, measured strokes. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel echoed against the silence of the woods. Ethan's throat was raw. He tried to speak, but the sound came out cracked like brittle wood. Why'd you help me?" The man looked at him, expression calm, unreadable. For a long breath, he said nothing. Then, in a voice deep and steady, he answered, "You were dying. No more explanation. No promise of safety. Just that." Ethan shifted, pain flaring at his side. His hand brushed the bandage, clean, wrapped tight, laced with the pungent scent of herbs. Whoever this man was, he knew how to treat wounds. Better than most field surgeons Ethan had seen during the war. The stranger rose and stepped outside, disappearing into the dawn mist. Ethan lay listening, the forest alive with whispers, branches creaking, birds calling, a stream gurgling in the distance. Every sound reminded him he was still far from any settlement, far from anyone he knew. And now, his only tether to life was a man whose name he didn't even know. The hours dragged. Fever returned in waves, bringing with it visions. He saw faces from the war, men he'd led, men he'd lost. His brother, Samuel, calling out across smoke and gunfire. Ethan reached for him in the dream, but always came up short, clutching only air. He woke drenched in sweat, breath ragged. The stranger returned carrying 2 rabbits, their bodies limp in his hands. With practiced ease, he skinned them, roasted the meat over the fire, and laid a portion on a flat stone near Ethan. The smell made Ethan's stomach twist with hunger, but pride kept him still. He didn't want to owe this man his life. Not more than he already did. At last, weakness won. Ethan dragged the meat toward him, biting into it. The flavor was gamey, unfamiliar, but it steadied him. He caught the stranger watching from across the fire, his gaze steady as a hawk's. "I didn't ask for your help," Ethan muttered, chewing through the pain. "You didn't need to," came the reply. That night, rain returned. It hammered the crude shelter, dripping through the branches. The stranger sat cross-legged by the fire, feeding it steadily, never letting it die. Ethan, shivering, watched him in the flickering glow. This man was a fortress, still, silent, unshaken by storm or darkness. Ethan envied that. Sleep crept up again, but not peacefully. He woke to snarls, low, guttural, circling the camp. Shadows moved at the tree line. Wolves. Ethan tried to rise, but the wound pulled him back down. The stranger was already on his feet, bow in hand. He loosed an arrow so fast, Ethan barely saw it fly. A yelp followed, sharp and brief. The wolves lunged, 3 shadows breaking from a brush. The camp erupted in chaos. Snarls, snapping teeth, firelight gleaming off wet fur. The stranger moved with precision. An arrow to one wolf, a knife to another. The third darted toward Ethan, eyes blazing, jaws wide. Ethan fumbled for his pistol, pain tearing through his body as he raised it. The shot rang out, deafening, fire spitting from the barrel. The wolf crumpled inches from his legs. Smoke hung in the air, acrid and sharp. Ethan's hand shook. The stranger stood over him, breathing heavy, knife dripping. For a moment, their eyes met. Ethan's wide with fear and adrenaline. The stranger's calm but fierce, like steel tempered in flame. Without a word, the man dragged the wolf carcasses to the tree line, leaving them as warnings. When he returned, he added wood to the fire and sat again, silent as ever. Ethan's chest heaved. His mind spun with doubt, fear, and something else, reluctant gratitude. He realized then that if not for this man, he'd already be a meal for the wolves. "Name," Ethan whispered, forcing the word past dry lips. "What's your name?" The stranger paused, then answered softly, as though the forest itself listened. "Tyanida." Ethan let the name settle on his tongue. Cherokee, no doubt. A people he had heard about only in stories. Stories twisted with fear, with hatred, passed down by men who'd never looked one in the eye. Now, staring at the man who had saved him twice in as many days, Ethan felt those stories crumble. The rain eased. Fire crackled. And for the first time since being shot down, Ethan allowed a sliver of calm to touch him. He wasn't safe. Not yet. But he wasn't alone. Days passed in a blur of pain and slow healing. Tyanida gathered herbs, crushed roots, laid cool poultices on the wound. Ethan fought fever dreams of war, of Samuel, of blood-soaked fields. Sometimes he woke to Tyanida sitting nearby, eyes closed, as if listening to something Ethan could not hear. Little by little, strength returned. He managed to sit upright, then to lean against the shelter wall, watching as Tyanida skinned hides, sharpened arrows, or disappeared into the woods with his bow and returned with food. Words were few between them. Trust came not from speech, but from survival. Shared fire, shared danger, shared silence. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Ethan finally spoke again. "You didn't have to save me." Tyanida's gaze stayed fixed on the fire. "I once saw a man left to die," he said quietly. "No one helped him. I would not let it happen again." Ethan studied him in the dim light, realizing how little he knew of this man, of his story, of the pain behind his eyes. But something shifted in him then, something small but real. He leaned back, letting the fire's warmth seep into his bones. For the first time since the ambush, he felt the faintest trace of hope. Out beyond the camp, the wilderness was vast, merciless, and waiting. And somewhere in that wilderness, the men who had left him for dead still roamed. Ethan knew they would come, and this time, he would not face them alone. The air had grown drier, sharper. Autumn leaves whispered in the branches overhead as Ethan took his first steps beyond the shelter. Each movement was a test of will. Pain burned in his ribs, but strength had returned enough for him to walk. His pistol hung heavy at his side, more comfort than weapon. Tyanida walked ahead, silent as ever, moving like part of the forest itself. His eyes scanned the land, reading signs Ethan couldn't begin to see. Broken twigs, faint tracks, the restless flight of crows. For a moment, Ethan thought they might slip unseen through the wilderness, that perhaps fate had granted him a second chance at life. But the sound shattered that fragile hope, the distant crack of a rifle. Both men froze. Tyanida's gaze swept toward the ridgeline. He motioned Ethan down low, his hand raised in warning. They crouched behind a cluster of rocks, hearts pounding as hoofbeats rumbled in the distance. The bandits. The same men who had laughed while Ethan bled in the dirt. Word had reached them somehow. He wasn't dead. An unfinished business has a way of dragging men back. Ethan's stomach turned. His mind flashed to the night of the ambush, to their faces twisted in cruelty. He could almost smell the whiskey on their breath. "They'll hunt me till I'm in the ground," he whispered. Tyanida's eyes narrowed, unreadable. "Then we do not let them find you in the ground." The chase began at dusk. The two men slipped into the trees, moving swift but silent. Behind them, voices carried on the wind, sharp and taunting. The bandits were closing in, confident, armed, eager for blood. Night fell, bringing with it a silver moon. They waded into a river, letting the current carry away their scent. Ethan's teeth chattered as the water bit into his wound, but he forced himself onward, following Tyanida's lead. They crawled onto the far bank, mud clinging to their skin. The night stretched long. At times, Ethan thought he heard whispers in the brush, men's laughter, the click of spurs. Tyanida motioned for silence, guiding them into the hollow of a cave. The darkness inside was suffocating, the air damp, but for a few precious hours, it was safety. Ethan leaned against the cold stone, sweat beading on his brow. "Why risk yourself for me?" he asked in a low voice. For a moment, Tyanida said nothing. Then, once, I had a brother. He was wounded in a raid. No one came. I buried him with my own hands. His voice cracked just slightly. I will not watch another brother die when I can stop it. The word struck Ethan harder than any bullet. He lowered his gaze, shame and gratitude mixing in his chest. Morning light crept into the cave. They moved again, climbing higher into the hills. But the bandits were relentless. By afternoon, the hunters became the hunted. Shots rang out, ricocheting off the rocks. Dust spat up near Ethan's boots as he scrambled for cover. Keep low, Tyanida barked, loosing an arrow from behind a boulder. A man cried out in the distance. Ethan returned fire, his pistol bucking in his hand. The crack of guns echoed through the canyon. A figure lunged from the shadows, knife flashing. Ethan barely blocked the strike. Pain seared his side as the two men grappled, dirt grinding into his wound. With a desperate surge, Ethan drove his attacker into the rocks, the man's skull cracking with a sickening thud. Breathless, shaking, Ethan looked down at the lifeless body. His chest heaved. For years, he had tried to leave the war behind. Now, the killing had followed him west. No time to dwell. More gunfire. Tyanida fought like a storm, bow singing, knife flashing. But then a shot. The sound tore through the canyon, and Tyanida staggered, blood staining his shoulder. No! Ethan shouted. He leapt forward, firing until the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. The last bandit fell, face first in the dust. Silence followed, broken only by Ethan's ragged breath. Tyanida dropped to one knee, gripping his wound. Ethan rushed to him, tearing his sleeve into a bandage, pressing it against the bleeding. Stay with me, Ethan muttered, his hands shaking. You didn't ride 3 days to save me just to die here. Tyanida's lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile. You learn fast. Rain swept over the canyon as if the heavens themselves sought to cleanse the blood spilled there. Ethan slung Tyanida's arm over his shoulder, half carrying him down the rocky slope. Each step was a battle, but he would not leave him, not after all that had been done. They found brief refuge in an abandoned mining shack. The wind howled through broken boards, rattling rusted tools. Ethan laid Tyanida on a cot, covering him with his own coat. The warrior's breathing was shallow, but steady. Ethan sat beside him through the night, pistol in hand, watching the door. Every creak of the wood made his finger twitch on the trigger. He had never felt so alive, nor so afraid. The bandits were not all dead. He knew it, and they would come. When dawn broke, pale light cutting through the cracks, Ethan looked out across the silent hills. The frontier stretched on forever, wild, untamed, merciless. But in his chest, for the first time, burned something steady. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was fighting for himself and for the man who had become more than an ally. The battle wasn't over. The real fight was yet to come, and Ethan Hale was ready. The wind screamed through the broken timbers of the mining town, carrying with it the stench of rust and old dust. Ethan crouched inside a crumbling building, his pistol gripped tight, sweat cold on his brow. Beside him, Tyanida leaned against the wall, face pale, his shoulder bound in fresh cloth. His strength was fading, but his eyes burned steady, watchful. Outside, hoofbeats thundered closer. Shadows moved between the skeletal remains of buildings, bandits, rifles glinting in the gray light of dawn. Their leader rode at the front, a broad-shouldered man with a scar like a jagged river across his jaw. He swung down from the saddle and shouted, his voice raw. You should have stayed dead, Hale. Ethan's chest tightened at the sound. That voice had been the last thing he heard before darkness swallowed him days ago. Rage flared hot and blinding, but he forced it down. He couldn't afford blind fury. Not now. Tyanida's hand touched his arm. Light, grounding. Patience, he whispered. The bandits fanned out, boots crunching on gravel. One kicked open a door, another climbed onto a porch, their guns sweeping the shadows. They thought they owned the place. Ethan breathed deep. The war had taught him something about men like these. Arrogance was a weakness. and weakness could be used. When the first bandit passed beneath their window, Tyanida loosed an arrow. It struck true, the man dropping without a sound. Chaos erupted, shouts, gunfire ripping the air. Ethan burst through the doorway, firing. Each shot echoed like thunder, each recoil biting in his wound, but he pressed on. A bandit fell, clutching his chest. Another spun and dropped in the dust. The leader bellowed orders, his voice cutting through the din. Find him. Bring me his scalp. Ethan ducked behind a barrel, bullets tearing splinters from the wood. His heart pounded, sweat dripping into his eyes. Across the street, Tyanida moved like a shadow, slipping from cover to cover despite his wound, knife flashing when his arrows ran out. The town became a battleground, shattered windows, burning doorframes, bodies in the dust. The air filled with smoke and the acrid stench of gunpowder. Then came the moment Ethan dreaded. A shot rang out, and Tyanida stumbled, falling hard to the ground. Blood soaked his bandage anew. "No!" Ethan roared. He surged from cover, emptying his pistol in a fury. The bandits scattered, retreating toward their leader. Ethan dropped beside Tyanida, pressing his hands against the wound. "Stay with me. Don't you quit on me now." Tyanida's eyes fluttered, his lips curling into the faintest grin. "I saved you. Now you return the favor." Rage and desperation fused in Ethan's veins. He rose, reloading with shaking hands, and marched into the open street. The leader stepped forward to meet him, rifle in hand, a sneer cutting across his scarred face. "You've got fire, soldier," the man spat. "But fire burns out. And today, you die for good." Ethan's grip tightened on his pistol. His voice came steady, hard as iron. "Not today." They circled one another in the dust, the town silent but for the moan of wind through broken shutters. The standoff stretched like a wire about to snap. The leader raised his rifle. Ethan fired first. The shot slammed into the man's chest, staggering him back. He cursed, fired wildly, the bullet grazing Ethan's arm. Ethan advanced, another shot tearing through the leader's shoulder, then the final round finding his heart. The man dropped to his knees, disbelief etched on his face, before collapsing into the dirt. Silence fell. The remaining bandits fled, spurred by fear. Their horses thundered out of town, leaving only the dead and the wounded behind. Ethan's pistol hung empty at his side, smoke curling from the barrel. He stood over the body of the man who had left him to rot in the wilderness, and for the first time since the war, the weight in his chest eased. Not gone, never gone, but lighter. He turned, rushing back to Tyanida. The warrior lay still, breath shallow, but alive. Ethan dropped to his knees, lifting him gently, cradling him against his chest. "You're not leaving me," Ethan muttered, his voice breaking. "Not after all this." Tyanida's eyes opened, faint but steady. "Brothers don't leave each other." Ethan held him through the dawn, the first rays of sunlight breaking over the hills. The mining town lay in ruin, but within that ruin, something unbreakable had been forged. By midday, Tyanida stirred, sitting weakly with Ethan's help. He gazed at the horizon, the endless stretch of wild country. "My road goes another way," he said quietly. Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to argue, to keep him close, but he understood. The frontier was vast, and no man's path could run alongside another's forever. Tyanida rose with effort, mounted his horse, and turned to Ethan one last time. No words were spoken. None were needed. In the silence of that look, trust and gratitude passed between them, stronger than iron, deeper than blood. Then he rode away, a lone figure fading into the wild. Ethan stood watching until the horizon swallowed him. Then he holstered his pistol, turned his face west, and breathed deep the morning air. He was alive, scarred, changed but alive. His past would never leave him, nor the memories of war, nor the faces of the men he had lost. But he had learned something in the crucible of blood and fire, that survival was not strength alone. It was trust, fragile, unspoken trust. And sometimes, strangers could become brothers. The wind carried the scent of rain, the promise of storms yet to come. Ethan pulled his coat tight, set his boots to the road, and walked on. In the wild frontier, there were no guarantees. But there was resilience, there was loyalty, and there was the will to rise again, even when the world left you for dead. And to those listening now, who have walked with Ethan through fire and shadow, remember, stories like his carry weight because they remind us what we, too, might endure and overcome. If this tale has moved you, if it has made you feel the grit of the frontier and the bond of unlikely brothers, then stay with us. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more journeys into the heart of the Old West. Because out here, every story carries a scar, and every scar tells us we survived.